All right, so welcome to the MPTA, and Iowa should also be joining us as well, Iowa Public Transit Association. ADA Toolkit overview. We're very excited to have everyone here, and we do certainly appreciate that. So thank you for joining us. Let's see if I can get my notes pulled up. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Mallory, and to Missouri and to Iowa for making this happen. National RTAP is very happy to present another ADA Toolkit overview for your audiences.
Thank you so much, Cara. And this toolkit was thoroughly updated in June 2020 with new content and resources and explanations, templates, questions and answers, glossaries, and more. The toolkit is meant to give rural and tribal transit managers an overview of their responsibilities under the American Disabilities Act, ADA, regulations, and to provide equal services to all passengers. So thank you so much, Cara, for your help with getting everything started. National RTAP, we want to thank them as well. We want to thank Iowa Public Transit Association, Beth, Hamby, and Buffy Ellis with KFH Group. Hi, guys. And for helping us with the update today. John Day is going to join us towards the end, and he's on now. He's the program manager with policy and technical assistance. Ooh, I ran out of space here. The Office of, my apologies, John, Civil Rights Federal Transit Agency will be available to answer any ADA related questions. Is there anybody on right now from the Iowa Public Transit Association that would like to make any announcements or member updates? You can send me a message in chat. Okay, we can save that for a little later too. From the MPTA, we just want to thank everyone again and want to remind you that our MPTA conference in September is currently transitioning to a virtual event. We plan to have details available shortly, so stay tuned to our website for more information on that, and we will also post that information onto the social media, our social media channels. All right, Cara, I'm going to toss it back to you. Thank you so much for your help, and looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say.
Great, thank you again, Mallory. And for those of you who might be new to National RTAP, National Rural Transit Assistance Program, we'd like you to know that we operate under a cooperative agreement between FTA and the Neponset Valley Transportation Management Association. Our overarching mission is to address the training and technical assistance needs of rural and tribal transit operators across the nation and to support all the state RTAP programs. Our comprehensive set of free technical assistance programs and resources includes toolkits such as this one, training materials, webinars, newsletters, technical briefs, peer resources, research, and innovative technology initiatives. So this toolkit, our ADA toolkit, was developed specifically for rural and tribal transit, FTA Section 5311 funded systems. It does not address requirements for rail, intercity bus, and ferry. And it does focus on what applies specifically to typical rural public transit systems, which are often very small organizations. Now, this presentation does not provide training on ADA requirements, but rather on where to find the info on those requirements within our ADA toolkit and also within the federal regulations that are contained within the toolkit. So I also do want you to know, most importantly, the toolkit provides technical assistance, not legal advice. So if you need legal advice, you are asked to consult with your agency's counsel and or your FTA regional civil rights officer. Okay, so next page, please. Now, we are very pleased to have two of our three expert preparers of the toolkit here from the KFH Group. We have Beth Hamby and Buffy Ellis with us here today. Ken Hosen was also one of the preparers of the toolkit. Next. And we'd also like to thank the reviewers of our 2020 ADA Toolkit update who serve on the National RTAP Review Board. These are all leaders in transit programs, rural and tribal transit, as well as state DOTs. So not only did they perform hours and hours of review on the individual pages, they were also the experts who identified gaps from the first version we did in 2014 to the version we have today. Next. The toolkit was developed, as I said, in 2014 for rural and tribal transit managers, and it focuses on ADA-related information for public bus systems, demand response services, and we strive to provide plain language, easily understood explanations for complex regulatory language, most namely 49 CFR Parts 37 and 38, the ADA regs. So the toolkit also provides ideas for best practices, many links to the actual regulations, guidance, and additional information. Next. To access the toolkit, very easy, go to nationalrtap.org. You don't even need the www, and click mouse over the word toolkit and click on the ADA toolkit. They're alphabetical, so it's the first one. Alternatively, you can go to nationalrtap.org/toolkit/ADA toolkit. We will be posting, or we actually already do have the PowerPoint up, so you can just download that from the National RTAP website and click right on it to get the toolkit. Next. Now I'm going to turn it over to Beth Hamby, who will start out talking about the expanded and updated toolkit sections.
Thank you, Cara. So the toolkit's organized into the following sections, a series of sections that I'll quickly introduce here, and then we'll delve into what's into each section and the subsequent slides. Each section is a web page within the toolkit. You can find a link to each section in the menu on the left-hand side of the screen on your desktop browser or tablet, or in a drop-down menu if you're accessing the toolkit on a smartphone. The slide contains a label for new, where a new section was added to the toolkit as part of this update and expanded where additional content was added to an existing section in the original toolkit. But importantly, new and expanded labels refer to new content in the toolkit, not new federal requirements. These labels are provided so that anyone who has used the 2014 edition of the toolkit will know where things have changed in the toolkit or what's been added. So in the order of how they appear in the menu, the sections are welcome, key regulations, standards, and guidance, service type requirements, and these are divided into 5 sections. There's a general requirements common to all service types, fixed route bus requirements, demand response requirements, route deviation requirements, and ADA complementary paratransit requirements. Next slide, please. So the toolkit also contains sections on vehicle and facility accessibility, accommodating riders using mobility devices, service animals, passenger assistance and customer service, rider information, public meetings and outreach, funding considerations, and questions and answers. And in addition to new and expanded, this slide contains a renamed and expanded label for 3 of the sections, which they have new names from the 2014 edition. Next slide, please. And other toolkit sections include new developments, glossary, and a series of sample policy templates. Next slide, please. So the welcome section is the toolkit's homepage, if you will. It includes a link to download a printer-friendly PDF of the entire toolkit. And the current, as of June 2020, edition of the toolkit is now posted. I understand that the National RTAP plans to update the PDF version once a year, and the web-based version that we'll be covering today can be updated incrementally as needed. So refer to the web page version and check the date at the bottom of each section page if you're wondering if there have been any updates to the toolkit. But then as the PDF is updated in a future year, National RTAP will announce that, so you can download the latest and greatest. The welcome page also includes a table of contents with links to each of the sections of the toolkit and acknowledgements. And I want to thank all the folks who contributed to this update. The National Review Board members had a major role in shaping the toolkit, including, as Cara mentioned, suggesting added content and reviewing drafts. Next slide, please. The first section after welcome is called Key Regulations, Standards, and Guidance. And this section is a roundup of the federal regulations and guidance on ADA, with which the rural transit managers need to be most familiar. The regulations are found in the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFRs, particularly the U.S. Department of Transportation regulations in 49 CFR Parts 37 and 38. The toolkit includes a table with links to each of these CFRs in the eCFR webpage, as well as other ADA implementing regulations enforced by other federal government agencies, such as the Department of Justice or Labor, that are provided for information. Links are also included to US DOT regulatory standards for transportation facilities and vehicles. And finally, links are provided to key federal guidance documents, beginning with the FTA ADA Circular number 4710.1, which was published in 2015. And the FTA ADA Circular is the resource with which rural and transit managers need to become familiar, and that really should be your primary source, as well as the regulations in 49 CFR Parts 37 and 38. They should be your Bible, basically. But this toolkit, one of the functions of this is to help you zero into the specific regulations that are relevant to a rural transit system. The links are also provided to other US DOT guidance and FTA-sponsored guidance provided by the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, or DREDA. You may have seen the topic guides that are linked to from the FTA webpage. And regulations and guidance are also cited and linked to throughout in the context throughout the toolkit, but this section provides you with a landing area, like one-stop shopping, to bring them all to your fingertips. And I should note that while this section focuses on federal guidance and regulations, other useful documents and resources are found throughout the toolkit, and you can find a list of section sources at the end of each section with links to each, as well as within the context of where they're referenced. Next slide, please. So the service type requirements section include both general requirements common to all service types, and then requirements specific to fixed route bus, demand response, route deviation, and ADA complementary paratransit. This is the sequence within the toolkit, but for today's presentation, we'll follow fixed route with ADA paratransit, since the requirement for paratransit is triggered by operating fixed route service. And there's an illustration on this page of a printed restaurant type menu. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier in the list of everything in there, the toolkit provides sample policy templates. And this slide presents a table that maps service types covered in the toolkit to the sample policy templates tailored for different service types. There wasn't a clean alignment in all cases, one policy template to one section of the toolkit. They were prepared as part of the toolkit update in response to requests from National Review Board members. And there are 4 sample policies provided here for rural transit agencies. One that is fixed route and ADA paratransit within the same policy. And these 2 types are grouped together in one template because fixed route, other than commuter bus, triggers the requirement to have complementary paratransit. So you can't have one without the other. Demand response policy template, and then 2 policy templates for route deviation. One that's titled route deviation, which is for service that deviates for the general public. The other is titled commingled fixed route and paratransit, which is for service that combines fixed route and paratransit on the same vehicle. Within each of these policy templates, there is text in different colors to help you customize for your agency. Red text needs to be customized. I should note that all of the text should be customized to reflect the transit agency's own local policies, but these templates simply provide examples of policies that address requirements. And then blue text, which is also italicized, provides customization instructions and explanatory notes, which need to be deleted from the transit agency's final policy. Next slide, please. So the general requirements for all service types section is new to the toolkit, or rather it was carved out of information that was on the each of the specific service type pages. We put that in one place that is referenced in each of the section specific toolkits pages. This section includes overarching non-discrimination requirements, US DOT regulatory definition of wheelchair, general provision of service requirements, again for all those service types, maintenance, including maintenance and use of accessible features, and other service requirements such as allowing service animals and allowing riders to travel with portable oxygen. And many of these are delved into more detail in their own section as well. There's a subsection on requirement to make reasonable modification of policies and practices, ADA training requirements, and complaint process requirements. And there's a photo on this slide of a driver deploying a rear lift on a small bus. Next slide, please. The first service type covered is fixed route bus. As a reminder for any listeners who may be tuning in from larger urbanized transit systems, this toolkit focuses on rural bus service and doesn't address ADA requirements for rail. The fixed route bus section opens with the US DOT ADA regulatory definition of fixed route. It includes a reminder to review the general requirements for all services common to each service type. It addresses requirements to acquire accessible vehicles for fixed route, including discussion of vehicles of historic character. It addresses fixed route specific requirements about maintenance of accessibility of equipment, what is required when a lift or ramp on a fixed route vehicle is found to be inoperative, passenger assistance and use of accessibility equipment. And the slide contains a simple illustration of a transit bus. Next slide, please. This section also discusses requirements related to route identification announcements at stops served by more than one route, upcoming stop announcements to passengers on board the bus to help passengers who cannot see outside the bus to stay oriented along the route. And there's a photo on this slide of the interior of a transit bus with a father and child apparently seated near the front and a stop requested sign illuminated. So if you can't see the stop, you wouldn't know to pull that cord to request the stop. So, this section also covers access to priority seating and securement areas, the requirement to provide ADA complementary paratransit service to individuals whose disabilities prevent them from using the fixed route system, which is addressed in its own section of the toolkit. We'll discuss that next. Accessibility of bus stops and surrounding pedestrian environment, including a discussion of flag stop considerations. And the other photo on this slide is of a very nice passenger shelter on a concrete pad that is not connected to a sidewalk. It's in a very rural area where there are no sidewalks and appears to be alongside a dirt shoulder. It's very common in rural areas, and that's to show that it'd be hard to get to that, use that shelter if you needed a sidewalk to get to it, such as using a mobility device. And finally, the section introduces providing rider information covered in more detail in another section of the toolkit, and travel training with resources for developing travel training programs. The section also includes a link to a sample policy template for fixed route and ADA complementary paratransit. And now I will turn the presentation over to my colleague Buffy Ellis to talk about the remaining service types. Thank you.
So thanks, Beth. So the toolkit has new and expanded material on ADA complementary paratransit. There are 3 new subsections, and they're designated with that bright yellow arrow. And as Beth had mentioned, new doesn't mean new regulations, it means new material in the toolkit. And then the remaining subsections have expanded material. And I'm gonna just in the next couple of slides touch on a few of the things in this subsection of the toolkit. So next slide, please. So the ADA regulations establish that complementary paratransit is to be origin to destination. But what does that mean in practice? It means that a transit agency needs to ensure that their riders can get from their origin location to their destination location. And some riders can do this on their own. They can get from the front door of their house, for example, to the vehicle, and then after deboarding can get from the vehicle to the building at their destination without any assistance. But there are other riders that will need help doing that because of their disability. And in terms of an operational policy, a transit agency can establish a policy that's either curb to curb or that it's door to door. But if the policy is curb to curb, the transit agency needs to provide door to door service when a rider needs that level of assistance because of their disability. Next slide, please. The toolkit also provides more information on the Regulation 6 service criteria. Some of these are relatively straightforward. For example, that all trip purposes must be served. There can be no prioritizing of trips because of purpose. Other criteria are perhaps less straightforward. For instance, provide a comparable response time. This does not mean that riders have to schedule a trip 24 hours in advance, but we have seen that in the past. What comparable response time means is that a transit agency must accept trip requests until the end of the business day, the day before the requested trip. So say a rider wants to book a trip for 10 a.m. on Thursday, that rider can call anytime the Wednesday before within the transit agency business hours to book that Thursday trip. The rider does not need to call at 10 a.m. on Wednesday for the 10 a.m. Thursday trip. And the 6 service criteria, no capacity constraints. The toolkit provides specific examples of operational patterns and practices that show that capacity may be constrained, and these are very helpful to review. Next slide, please. The toolkit also addresses the eligibility certification process, explaining the 3 categories of eligibility and also the 3 types of eligibility that are granted to riders. Eligibility for visitors is also explained, as well as the process for determining how long visitor eligibility lasts. Next slide, please. Then the toolkit has a new piece that's titled Other ADA Complementary Paratransit Operational Requirements and Considerations. Boy, that's a mouthful. In this section, there's a discussion about an issue that some rural transit agencies may face in serving their ADA riders, and that is having to provide service over unpaved roads or roads that are in very poor shape and then operate over those same roadways in really bad weather. And in some cases, this may not be safe. Conditions pose a direct threat to the health or the safety of others, and the transit agency can deny service to locations on that unsafe road during those unsafe times. And there's more information about this in the toolkit. So next slide. Trip negotiation. That's another topic in the toolkit. Trip negotiation is essentially a scheduling tool that's allowed by the ADA so that a transit agency can negotiate with a rider the rider's requested pickup time within 1 hour before to 1 hour after the requested time. But there are parameters to that negotiation, and they're explained in the toolkit. There's an expanded discussion of no-shows. The toolkit explains how to set up a process to determine if a rider has a pattern or practice of no-showing, and there's added information from the FTA circular that Beth noted. Topic of suspensions is addressed, and what's important here is that a rider must be notified before a possible suspension, that the rider can appeal that suspension, and that the FTA generally considers that suspensions longer than 30 days are excessive. Next slide. So Beth had mentioned the toolkit includes several policy templates that a transit agency can use to edit and then customize. And so this first template addresses ADA paratransit as part of the template for fixed route bus. So the template is really quite easy to use. There are embedded directions, and then there's text that indicates where a transit agency would add in its own information. So these are very useful tools in the toolkit. Next slide, please. Their toolkit has an expanded section on demand response service. It defines demand response service, which actually includes a variety of service types, such as dial-a-rides and taxi subsidy programs. But in the context of ADA regulations, demand response does not include ADA complementary paratransit. That has its own requirements, as we just went over. And in this section, the toolkit addresses vehicles for demand response service, saying that all vehicles acquired for use and providing demand response service must be accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities, including those who use wheelchairs. Inaccessible vehicles may only be acquired for demand response service if the service, when viewed in its entirety as a whole service, provides equivalent service to individuals with disabilities, again, including those who use wheelchairs. And then the toolkit goes on to explain what equivalent service means. There's a new section also on contracting with taxi companies and transportation network companies such as Uber and Lyft. We typically call those TNCs. If a transit agency does use taxis and/or TNCs to provide demand response service, then the transit agency has to ensure that equivalent service is provided. Again, that term equivalent service. And there's also a sample ADA policy template for demand response service. So next slide, please. Route deviation. So that's the next section in the toolkit. The characteristics of route deviation are described. Basically, it's a service that operates along established routes. Typically, it has designated stops, and then between those stops, vehicles can deviate or go off from the route to pick up or drop off riders within a defined off-route service area. Riders typically would call in advance to request an off-route pickup. Route deviation also has several other names. It's deviated route, deviated fixed route, flexible route, or flex route service, and maybe we've missed some. For the purposes of ADA regulations, though, it's important to note that transit services are considered to be either fixed route or demand response. But where does route deviation fit? Is it demand response or is it fixed route? In order for it to be considered demand response and thus not subject to the requirements for ADA paratransit, route deviation must deviate in response to requests from any passenger, general public service. And in that case, the service complies with the requirements that apply to demand response service. In some cases, however, route deviation service does not deviate for any rider, and in that case, the service is not considered demand response within the context of ADA regulations. It's considered fixed route and therefore is subject to the requirements for ADA paratransit. So the second type of route deviation, I think Beth had alluded to this, it's called commingled fixed route and paratransit service. And the toolkit provides more information about how this commingled fixed route and paratransit service should work. And there's a policy template in the toolkit for both types of route deviation service. So now I'm going to hand it back to Beth.
Thank you, Buffy. The next section is vehicle and facility accessibility. On the original toolkit, this was called physical standards. And this section introduces the standards of the U.S. Access Board and the U.S. Department of Transportation. Under vehicle, the toolkit summarizes the accessibility specifications for buses and vans under 49 CFR Part 38 and includes discussion of additional mobility device considerations such as purchasing equipment that can accommodate larger and heavier mobility devices than the minimum Part 38 standards can accommodate, and vehicle step height considerations. Under facilities, the update added discussion of bus stop standards, bus stop inventory and planning, and signage and wayfinding. And finally, a discussion of equivalent facilitation has been added to the toolkit. And if you didn't already know, equivalent facilitation is the process for requesting permission to depart from the technical standards in the DOT ADA regulations and to use alternative designs or technologies to provide equal or greater accessibility. And this slide contains photos of a couple of buses, small and large, stopped at transit centers. Next slide, please. The toolkit has a section called Accommodating Riders Using Mobility Devices. And this section replaced the original ADA toolkit section known as Mobility Device Rule Change, which focused on September 2011 final rule that eliminated the use of the term common wheelchair. This slide contains a photo of a driver assisting a passenger in a wheelchair and using the lift. And as part of the update, we added discussions on different types of mobility devices, ensuring transit vehicles and facilities can physically accommodate riders using mobility devices, and operating policies on accommodating riders using mobility devices. Next slide, please. Operating policies on accommodating riders using mobility devices are introduced in other sections of the toolkit as well, but they're addressed in more depth in this section. The list of topics addressed in this section includes using accessibility features, deploying lift at any stop, adequate time to board, allowing standees on the lifts and ramps, boarding direction on lifts, allowing a passenger to board forward facing if they choose, pushing a manual wheelchair onto the lift or ramp, accommodating riders who use wheelchairs if the lift and vehicle can physically accommodate them, accommodating bariatric riders who use mobility devices. And there's a photo of a standing man boarding using a wheeled walker. And I should note this is from the National RTAP's marketing toolkit. As you may know, the National RTAP website has 7 toolkits. And the marketing toolkit has a great library of photos and graphics for rural transit agencies to use in their marketing materials. Next slide, please. Additional policies discussed in this section of the toolkit include access to the securement area, use of securement devices, use of seat belts and shoulder harnesses, requesting that riders transfer to a seat, strollers as mobility devices, such as pediatric wheelchairs, and other considerations for assisting riders who use mobility devices. And this slide also contains a photo from the National RTAP's marketing toolkit of a driver securing the shoulder harness for a rider using a wheelchair. Next slide, please. So the next section is on service animals, and it starts with a definition of a service animal. And we included both the U.S. Department of Transportation definition and the U.S. Department of Justice regulation or definition because they're different. But the important thing is that transportation agencies need to follow the U.S. Department of Transportation definition and not limit service animals to dogs and miniature horses, as the Department of Justice definition does. There's a photo of a dog on this slide. The section addresses two questions that may be asked to determine whether or not an animal is a service animal. However, discusses that transportation agencies cannot require special ID cards or other documentation or ask about the person's disability, but the toolkit does include a case study of an approach, a voluntary approach developed by Lane Transit District in Eugene, Oregon to reduce potential confusion and conflicts for drivers in making that determination. It's called a paw print endorsement program, and there's a mark on the rider's ID card that indicates that they've answered the two allowable questions in advance, and thus they don't need to be asked that every time they board with the service animal. But again, very important that this is not required of the riders because you can't require certification of a service animal. It's just makes it a little quicker as long as, assuming the operators are all trained to follow that policy. And this section also provides a number of links to service animal resources. Next slide, please. The section on passenger assistance and customer service covers personnel training requirements, customer service guidelines, general guidelines for all customers, and it provides communication tips for serving customers with various types of disabilities that were gleaned primarily from the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center's Transportation Operator Pocket Guide and the Job Accommodation Network's Effective Accommodation Practices series. So it addresses communicating with individuals with hearing impairments, vision disabilities, those who use wheelchairs, use service animals, have intellectual disabilities, and psychiatric disabilities. And there's a photo of a person at a desk working on a computer, probably scheduling paratransit trips and providing customer service. Next slide, please. The next section is called Rider Information, and the updated toolkit expands upon the original toolkit version of the section. As the transportation agencies must make service available to people with disabilities, including those with vision and hearing disabilities. And it covers requirements related to provide adequate communications through accessible formats and technology to enable users to obtain information and schedule service. Also discusses the requirements for information and application process for ADA complementary paratransit service. Presents federal requirements and standards for information and communication technology that are not DOT regulations, and these are not requirements for non-federal agencies, but they're shared here in the toolkit as technical assistance. As the U.S. Department of Justice, for example, has provided recommended the Access Board Section 508 standards for electronic and information technology as technical guidance. So we provided links to that. The rider information section of this toolkit also discusses accessible formats for people with vision disabilities and hearing and speech disabilities, and discusses information provided at transit facilities and in transit vehicles. Next slide, please. So the public meetings and outreach section is another new section added to this toolkit. It provides suggestions and recommended practices for ongoing public participation. Transit agencies have public participation requirements well beyond ADA as part of a transit agency's general public participation efforts. For example, when planning a fare increase or major service change, but it's important to engage individuals with disabilities in that process. There are specific public participation requirements for related to ADA paratransit planning and service changes, and it's important to engage people with disabilities on an ongoing basis, such as through a citizens advisory committee. The section provides suggestions and links to additional resources on hosting accessible meetings. Next slide, please. The update added a new section called Funding Considerations, and this section is about money, and our slide includes a couple of dollar signs to illustrate that. The section provides a general overview of funding sources commonly used by rural transit agencies to fund accessible services, and our slide includes excuse me, my notes were redundant. Note that this section does not mention the CARES Act funding, which is on the list to address in a future update. It also discusses how FTA funding relates to ADA requirements. Of course, the DOT ADA requirements are not limited to FTA funding recipients. The requirement that applies to all public entities, as well as the requirements that apply to private entities. However, compliance with ADA requirements is a condition of eligibility for receipt of federal funding, and FTA-funded public transportation services are subject to the ADA requirements for public entities, even if the organization operating the service is private, due to the standing in the shoes requirement that applies to private agencies that receive Section 5311 funding through sub-grant agreements, directly through state agencies, or through subrecipients who enter into agreements with private contractors for services. And there are other requirements when that's invoked, but that's always important to keep in mind, public entity requirements. And this section also discusses coordination with other sources of transportation support for people with disabilities. Next slide, please. Questions posed to the National RTAP in recent years from rural transit agencies are addressed in a questions and answers section. Each question is shown on the web page, and by clicking on the question, the response appears, it drops down. Not all of the topics in the toolkit are covered, but questions are grouped by topics, including general questions, fixed route bus service, ADA complementary paratransit, accommodating riders using mobility devices, service animals, funding, and emergency management, which obviously we don't have a section called that here. And I need to underscore again that the responses to these questions are technical assistance and not legal advice. Please refer to the Civil Rights FAQ on the FTA website, and a link is provided to that in the toolkit. Next slide, please. There's a section on new developments that's been updated to include new and emerging transportation modes and technologies such as microtransit, transportation network companies such as Lyft and Uber, which Buffy mentioned, automated and connected vehicles, and wheelchair charging stations, which can be a passenger amenity. Recent changes to ADA-related rules, federal rules and standards since 2018 are included here. We've had a 2-year threshold for grouping them as recent. And so right now, just information and communications technology final standards and guidelines that were issued by the Access Board that went into effect in March 2018. And these are addressed in the rider information section on a more permanent basis, so when they cycle out of here. And again, those are not requirements under the Department of Transportation, but they're provided as technical assistance guidance. And of course, COVID-19 is the big new development. That has not been addressed in this toolkit, but it's on the list for potentially at the next update. And it, as is the previously mentioned CARES Act funding, as you probably already know, FTA maintains a webpage with frequently asked questions regarding COVID-19 and the CARES Act, and ADA-related questions are found under civil rights in those questions. Next slide, please. Finally, the last 2 sections in the ADA toolkit are a glossary, which was compiled for this update, and the sample policy templates, which we've already described. Next slide, please. And here is our contact information, as well as defined contact information for your FTA Regional Civil Rights Officer. And this concludes the presentation section of the webinar. Thanks so much for tuning in, and now it's time for questions.
All right, we'd like to open it up to questions now. So anybody who would like to ask a question, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And there is also the option for chat. So please feel free to send us a question and we'll get those answered for you. In the meantime, I'll make sure to get this downloaded and uploaded to our website. I will send Iowa and National RTAP a copy of the webinar as well. And so you're certainly will have access to these slides. Any questions? We do have an ADA expert with us. Thank you, Dorothy. We appreciate that. Dorothy Yeager says this is a wonderful resource. Thank you so much, Dorothy. Matt Crawford also, no questions from him. Anybody else? The presentation must have been pretty thorough then. That's probably more good than bad. But you know, John, we do appreciate you coming on today to offer your expertise and guidance. Is there anything that you'd like to say comment-wise while we're wrapping up?
I don't really think so. You know, I was just sort of intending to be here as a resource for questions. So if everybody's perfectly clear on everything they've heard, then this is the easiest panel I've ever done.
Okay, excellent. We'll have you back anytime then.
All right.
Great. Okay, then. So we'll do one last call for questions. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up and let you go early, gift you 15 minutes back into your day, which I know is a good thing for most of us. And with that, thank you for being here. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to National RTAP. Thank you to KFH Group for helping us get this together as well. And thank you, John, for being here as well. So thank you all again, and we will get this uploaded in the next couple of hours. So take a look for that. And we'll see you at the next Missouri Public Transit Education event series. So thank you and have a great day.